The Dancing with Depression podcast is brought to you by CAS-CM, where CM stands for Content Matters, because content brings people together. Welcome to the Dancing with Depression podcast, where shared experiences open conversations that connect, educate, and support those affected by mental health, whether they have a formal diagnosis or are caring for someone who does. I'm your proud host, Adam Turner. Today's episode is a little different. I'm sitting down with someone I'm very proud to call a lifelong friend, Mark. A brother, father, grandfather, and retired Marine. As we talk about a world I know very little about, the military. On the surface, Mark and I have a lot in common. We both grew up in the North, bonded over sports and music, and somehow found ourselves in the same world of digital marketing and sales. But beneath those similarities is an entirely different life experience. One shaped by service, structure, sacrifice, and stories most of us only encounter from a distance. What started as a single conversation quickly became something much bigger, deeper, more emotional, and more perspective shifting than either of us expected. So much so that was originally planned to be a 30-minute episode into an hour-and-a-half conversation and 3 episodes. Rather than rush it, we chose to honor the conversation, to slow it down, let the stories breathe, and give each part the space it deserves. This first episode sets the foundation. It explores how two people can share similar interests, yet see the world through very different lenses, shaped by their own lived experiences. Like how I envisioned Godzilla when Mark was sharing a story about banana spiders. It's about listening, truly listening, to a perspective that deserves to be heard, especially by those of us who've never worn the uniform. I'm grateful Mark trusted me and all of you with his story. Let's begin. So, as I mentioned, Mark is joining us today, and what we're going to talk about is going to be a lot geared towards, experiences he's had and knowledge that I clearly have nothing to offer. However, I think it's also good to know how Mark and I met. I would say it's fairly safe to say that it starts with working at the same company, but I think the tie was sports, enjoyment of sports. Family's important to both of us, and I think the strongest tie has been and always will be sarcasm. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, I think that's accurate description. And music, or, love for 90s hip hop and rap.
That would also be a good one. Good call. So first and foremost, thanks. I'm glad we got a chance to get together. We've known each other for a long time, ever since I moved to Charlotte. But I kind of jokingly feel like you lived 2 full lives before you ever met me. And so we'll definitely get into that a little bit. But the things that we mentioned allowed us the opportunity to chat. And I've always liked our conversations because, A, it was coming from a space that I didn't know information about, but you were always willing to share, to educate me and kind of bring me in at my pace. So specifically on the Marine side, but can you share just a little bit about where that commonality came with the sports and family and sarcasm and all the the good stuffs that we first started to talk about.
Yeah, so I can't remember if you were there first or if I was there and then, who started when, but working in close environment like we did, it was fun. There were definitely some characters in that group and, some that you wanted to talk more with and some that you wanted to talk less with. And, and that's very similar with life. You run across people like that, but I always felt that, we kind of had that, bond of being from the Northeast and, the teams that, you liked weren't, who I hated. So you kind of
It's a
keep
big factor.
you kind of keep, friends close and your enemies closer. But, the commonality of not liking certain teams, that was always nice. And then there were, several other things, not to bore people with our bromance, but your love of mountain biking and, testing me out there, getting me out of my comfort zone, at the Whitewater Center, going down the crazy hills and things that I was literally not mentally or physically prepared for. So,
Oh gosh. Here's the
those,
sarcasm, laying it
yeah,
on thick.
there's a lot of things, that I felt, we were, I don't know, destined but to be lifelong friends in that capacity, kind of like Gilligan and the skipper. So,
There you go. There you
yep.
go. That was going to be a reference. And I already know you're setting me up because you've got video of me on the mountain bike coming out of the trails. So just everybody be prepared because Mark does things with intent. It's not by accident. So we'll have these inter conversations along the way. But as far as like, just sports in general, like you also played and you were able to talk about the game, not just from a couch potato standpoint, but provide some real cool insight. And so I really enjoyed that as I sucked at fantasy football and thought maybe if I got some insights from you, I would do better. And I did, but then we played against each other and well, let's not get into that. So, but I had a chance to also, connect with you in a manner in which I was curious about an aspect of your life that I really didn't have any insight from. And I was definitely on a scale of 1 to 10, I was a 10 in curiosity, but I was also very cautious because I wanted to respect just in general things that maybe were not appropriate to ask and so on. And you always, allowed me to kind of ask, and I don't really think I ever got denied, but you also had a great way of answering things when maybe you didn't want to answer them. But can you share a little bit about your experience leading you into enlisting into the Marines and what things were like before and what things were
Yeah,
like during and maybe even after?
of course. I grew up playing sports, and that's just what we did. Small town, Western Pennsylvania, we played a different sport every season. And so football season, it was football. Winter, it was wrestling. Spring and summer, baseball or whatever the sport was, like we were constantly playing that. And, my father was a World War II vet from the Navy. My brother, who's 5 years older, probably, one of my role models, enlisted in the Marine Corps and he was doing the Marine Reserve as he was going to college. And so, like, the military, even, like, the possibility of, the Naval Academy, of going that route when I was in high school, in the boarding school I was in, was always something I thought of, and not just as a family obligation or tradition, but, for, your country. You serve your country. It's like you do your duty, whether it's, 4 years and get out or whether it's, 30 years and retire. That had always been, in the back of my mind of like I should do this. And, so college came along and, things didn't go the first time around, in college, like most people. Being young and going to school was, it was hard. And like every 17, 18, 19-year-old, I knew everything already, so there was no reason to do it. So tested out the world a little bit, and when Desert Shield, and of course I'm aging myself a little bit, but Desert Shield started, I thought, okay, this is my turn. Like my dad had World War II, my uncles had, Vietnam era. It's like, okay, this is time for me to, go and do my public service. And so I enlisted. And so by the time I actually got to boot camp and, through all the military training, Desert Storm had kind of calmed down a little bit, but I was still in a unit that we actually went, to that area, just after everything calmed down, to kind of like a peacekeeping and those types of scenarios. So that's kind of how I got into the military. And, I found out like, hey, like, within the first 4 years, I'd been to 28 countries, and it was an eye opener. We were in Guantanamo Bay, Cuba, and, Somalia. We were there before Black Hawk Down. We were there right after. So some of the things that you see movies about, like those were things that we were actually doing. And some of those, like, I know a question you may have is like, how did some of those places change your perspective? Growing up in a small Western Pennsylvania town, like you have no idea. And this is before the internet, this is before social media. Like you saw the news, your parents read the newspaper, but you really didn't know what was going on. And then, it came to a point like we were the people that were enforcing the politicians' policies. And, sometimes what they said that they were going to do wasn't always what was being done, by the time we got there. And so that
Yeah.
was, an eye-opening experience. And the support that we got after coming back was so different than Vietnam. And anytime at the VA and I see those Vietnam vets and, Korean, there aren't many World War II vets around anymore, but the military people that were there before us, far harder than what we get now. I'm not going to say that everyone did, but for the most part, because when they came back, they had the support of the American public, for the most
Mhm.
part. Now, I actually got out after, or, by the time I was out, the Iraq and Afghanistan, those wars or those conflicts or whatever you want to call it, I was already out at that time. And so now those guys, like I see the younger generation coming in to the VA and they have a different perspective and they have different issues than, kind of like my generation did. So that's kind of my military dossier or profile in a nutshell, the high level Cliff Notes edition.
Sure. Sure. And so when you talk about like the beginning of your life growing up in a small Western Pennsylvania town, then the amount of countries that you went to in a short period of time, how do you process that? Like, it's not so much what are you seeing, but what are you noticing that you have to process? And who helps you process that?
That's a great question because, Western Pennsylvania, like it was huge to go across a state line, like Ohio or New York or even West Virginia, like to get into a different state was just like boggling that you would be able to, oh my God, I'm in a different state. And then as you venture out and you're in different countries, and I mean, Guantanamo Bay, Cuba, can't really count that because it's encircled with active minefields, and it's not like you're going out in town and, hanging out with the locals in in Cuba.
Right. Wow.
But when you get to other countries, and I was part of a Marine expeditionary unit, and so we were on, 5 different ships, naval ships, and we would, go to a port. And, the majority of places would not be high on anybody's bucket list to go. And
Gotcha.
now sometimes, like when we were coming back, we hit, Greece, or we hit Spain, or those types of port cities where you actually got to get out and kind of visit with the locals. But, some of the areas, like my thought in my early 20s was, United States is the best. And I'm not saying that it isn't, but it's the best and everybody wants to come here. Everyone wants to be like us. And the realization is like a lot of foreign countries have great countries as well. And some, are not big fans of the US, based upon our economy or whatever politics or who's in, whether it's, Republican, Democrats, it doesn't matter. Like there are a lot of people that don't like us in foreign countries. And having the, I don't know if I was lucky to just feel like, hey, we're great, but there are other great people, great countries. And, working with different units from Australia, from in a United Nations type of theater, the Pakistanis, like I lived with the Pakistanis for 2 weeks and we were immersed, doing training for them. And like, it was like living in Pakistan. Like that's, the training we did for them, but the rest of the day we were amongst them. And when you're told to go pick out your lunch, it was a goat and and it was butchered, right
How many
there. And
goats did you have before that?
I'll tell you, it was 2 weeks and like I was kind of happy to go back to the MREs, the meals ready to eat after that time. I'm not saying it wasn't good, I'm an adventurous eater, but, it was definitely different, and then we're on ship with the Australians, and at noon, they had beer 30, they got 2 beers when you're on ship with their lunch, and then the Italians, they had drink boxes that were wine, and, so you're working with different countries and, what's acceptable to them and what are kind of the thoughts of our military, like, God, 2 beers, like, that would be great morale for the troops, but, especially the Marines, like, 2 beers leads to 20, and then, they're doing things that there's just too many international incidents come from us, and
And I
crossed through the Suez Canal, we actually had what was called a Steel Beach picnic where, they grilled out and they actually gave us 2 beers. And I'm not a big drinker, so I sold mine. I think they were like $10 a beer. So I sold my beers to people, so just those types of things. But to answer your question, to get back to that, I was lucky, I think, to have perspective and whether it was politics, whether it was religion, whether it was, economics, to see different point of views and not say that's stupid, you're wrong, right? But to look at like, hey, maybe there is a different way to do things.
For sure. And that resonated in conversations that we had. There were a lot of times where it was the way that you could deliver the message was not an attack. It was look at it from this perspective. Would you say that that was a skill you had previous to your service, or was that something you think maybe you developed throughout that process?
I think it's definitely something that developed before that. Leadership in sports, being a captain was, you do this because I said. And, and then having some great leaders in the Marine Corps, like, hey, we have to do this. This mission, accomplishment is, the number one thing, and then the troop welfare is secondary to that. But once the mission's accomplished, then everything else comes from that. And there were times in the military where I learned more from poor leadership than I did from great leadership, especially because some of the poor leadership was someone that could possibly even been younger than I was at the time, less experience, but had a higher rank because they came in, a lot earlier than I did. And there were situations like that, like, you do this because I told you to. And, you couldn't say, hey, I quit, or like, if you're not feeling good that day, you know what, I'm gonna take a mental health day and not go to work. Like, you can't do that in the military. And I didn't realize that, like, until I got out. Fast forward to year 2000, and I'm in San Antonio, Texas, and actually I was living with a couple Marine canine instructors who were working at the schoolhouse for all the military. And they would go out and, sometimes they would have like long weekends, and I was the designated driver, and I was like, "Man, I can't go out. I gotta go to work tomorrow." They're like, "Just call in sick." And I hadn't done that. Like, even in boarding school and high school, I never missed a day of school. And in the military, like, if you were sick, like, you still had to get up and go to sick call to medical. And sometimes you'd wait 2 or 3 hours, and they would tell you, "Okay, you're on late duty for a day, go back to work." You know? I broke my foot, playing soccer, and they're like, "All right, do you wanna put a cast on it?" Or I was like, "W is it?" It's like, "It's not gonna do anything, you're just gonna hobble along for a while, but you have to go back to work, you're on late duty, you just can't run." So you still go to work.
I I would just love to have been a fly on the wall when you're in interviews after and they start talking about, like, paid time off, and you're like,
Yeah,
What's
it
that?"
yeah. Work-life balance, like,
Yeah.
like, I was on ship for total of like 8 months, and I think 52 days we didn't get off the ship for the first 52 days, and crossing the Atlantic, going through, and, you know, things like that. And then, like, work-life balance, you're getting woken up at, 2 AM, especially on ship, you're gonna watch a little dial and, like, "What am I doing?" They're like, "If that gets this, you pick up that phone and call," on a pressure or something. I was like, "Well, what happens if I don't?" Like, "The ship blows up." You know?
There's there's so many things going through my mind right now because I got a chance to experience this type of conversation over an extended period of time. But
Mm.
as we're talking, I'm picking some of the things that we used to talk about. Like, for example, you talked about, taking orders or somebody was outranking you. They might have had poor leadership skills, but because they maybe signed up early or whatever the case is. Very similar to like corporate America, where you and I would be sitting there and I'm looking at it like just because you're a good sales rep doesn't mean that you're a good sales manager of
Right,
people and
right.
so on, right? So there are some similarities, and because clearly I had nothing to draw from on that military side, there was still a very, very tight connection like that. And also some of the scenarios that I recall where I was having a bad day and I felt the need to share that with you. And you would so eloquently say something to the effect of, "Oh, yeah, no, I definitely understand." It reminds me of when we were in the desert and we had spiders the size of, I don't remember what you said,
Yeah.
and somebody had to stand guard and shoot them. Is that accurate?
Somewhat accurate. You've embellished a little
Okay.
bit, but, the story was probably, like, when you complained it was hot, and I was like, "Oh, yeah," kinda like when we were in full gear in the desert, 120 degrees at night. So, something like that. But there
Yeah,
were, banana spiders that were the size of your
banana
hands
spider.
that you would hear before you saw them as they're
Yeah.
scurrying across.
Well, as folks who have listened to me previous, I don't try to embellish it, but I probably made those spiders out to be like the size of Godzilla because that's just the way I felt hearing the story.
Mm-hmm.
So, did you anticipate the retirement of the Marines the way that it happened? Like, when you were in your first couple of years, what path did you see? Did you see it as a career? Did you see it as a 30-year, or was it a 4 and out? As we wrap up the first part of my conversation with Mark, I want to pause here intentionally. What we've talked about today sets the foundation, not just for understanding where he's been, but for understanding the world he stepped into. In the next episode, Mark shares how he once envisioned his military career, the expectations he carried, the direction he thought his life would take, and how family played a meaningful role in the decisions he made along the way. That perspective adds important context to everything we've discussed so far, and it deepens the story in a way that's worth taking time with. Thank you for being here and for listening. We'll continue the conversation in the next episode. And remember, when it comes to depression, take the lead. Thank you for joining us on another episode of Dancing with Depression. There's a saying that hindsight is 20/20, which is often used to describe the phenomenon of being able to see things more clearly after they've happened. With that in mind, I encourage you to reflect back on past experiences in an effort to better understand your now. Also, I invite you to share with me your comments, thoughts, or personal exposure to depression. You can email me at dancingwithdepression@yahoo.com. Until next time, keep moving forward, and when it comes to depression, remember to take the lead. The Dancing with Depression podcast may include discussions of suicide, self-harm, trauma, and emotional distress. Listener discretion advised. This podcast shares personal experiences and is not a substitute for professional mental health care. If you need immediate support, call or text 988, the Suicide and Crisis Lifeline. For non-crisis help and resources, contact NAMI at 1-800-950-6264.